When the team behind Exus activated Grok 4 and someone in the room asked almost offhand, "Who is Jesus?" the reaction was immediate. Surprise, curiosity, and then a careful turning of the gears as the machine began to answer. What followed wasn't a sermon or a conversion speech. It was a series of data-driven inferences, probability estimates, pattern recognition, manuscript comparisons that pushed a question traditionally framed in theology into the realm of statistical reasoning. The result was, by many accounts in that room, shocking. An advanced model applying cold logic landed on conclusions that, at minimum, made Christianity, or at least the historic figure at its center, look like a remarkably coherent explanation for a set of historical and probabilistic facts. But before anyone starts treating a model's output as gospel, we need to slow down. What did Grok actually do? What assumptions did it make? And what can we legitimately learn from an AI drawing lines between math and meaning? First, a quick word about Grok and the context. Grok 4 is a large, sophisticated model developed by XI as part of a push to build systems that sift through massive amounts of text and data to produce concise analyses. It's designed to detect patterns, weigh evidence, and present probabilistic judgments. It has access to enormous corpora, scientific literature, historical texts, translations, modern commentary, and the Internet's messy archive. It is not conscious. It does not possess faith, moral agency, or spiritual insight. What Grok offers is an interpretation of data shaped by its training and by the prompts given to it. That means its outputs reflect not only raw facts, but also the assumptions baked into its inputs. Keep that in mind at every step. Now consider the first set of calculations Grok reportedly ran: the origin of life. Abiogenesis, the transition from non-living chemistry to self-replicating biology, remains one of science's most complex and contested questions. When you try to express the difficulty of producing even a minimal genome in probabilistic terms, the numbers can look astronomically small. Grok presented scenarios where the likelihood of assembling a functionally meaningful strand of genetic information through purely random processes was compared to numbers like 1 in 10 to 200 or 1 in 10 to 600. Those are not precise universal constants. They are outputs of models that rely on assumptions about the length of sequences, the number of necessary correct arrangements, and the mechanisms available in early Earth chemistry. To make sense of those huge numbers, imagine the following. Picture a vast library containing every possible arrangement of letters in a volume larger than our observable universe. If only one arrangement writes a coherent sentence, the chance of pulling that book by random is effectively zero for practical purposes. The comparison is hyperbolic, but it illustrates why researchers sometimes favor inference to design. If the prior probability of a complex information-rich structure emerging by chance is vanishingly small, then positing a directed process, intelligence, selection, or law-like mechanism becomes a more plausible explanation in a Bayesian sense. That is, you compare how well different hypotheses predict the data you observe and assign relative credence accordingly. Grok applied that kind of Bayesian thinking. It treated hypotheses, naturalistic spontaneous assembly, long chains of chemical selection, guided assembly by an intelligent agent, as competing explanations for the presence of complex molecular information. Under many of the parameter sets Grok evaluated, the hypothesis that an intelligence directed the origin of life scored higher as a posterior probability. Again, that does not equate to proof. Models are only as good as their priors and variables. If you widen assumptions about prebiotic chemistry, allow for long timescales and unknown selection mechanisms, the naturalistic probabilities can improve. Grok did not claim to have exhausted every plausible chemical pathway. What it did was show that, given certain conservative assumptions about how much information is needed and how randomly it would have to assemble, the numbers favor explanation by an intelligent cause. The point here is less a metaphysical slam dunk and more a conceptual bridge. When mathematical improbability is high enough, reason naturally considers explanations that invoke purpose or agency. From origins, the conversation Grok helped frame moved to historical evidence for Jesus. This is where the task shifts from probabilistic chemistry to not only textual criticism, but also historiography, the discipline that assesses how we know what happened in the past. Grok summarized several features historians often cite when weighing the historicity of a figure: the multiplicity and independence of sources, early dating of documents, the geographical and cultural embeddedness of the narratives, and corroborating archaeological finds. Start with manuscripts. The New Testament, particularly the Gospels and the letters, survives in thousands of manuscript copies, far more than many other ancient works. Textual critics use this mass of evidence to reconstruct earlier readings, and the idea is straightforward. When many manuscripts preserve a text, especially copies that diverge in ways traceable to different copying traditions, scholars can triangulate back toward an earlier form. Grok highlighted that the time gap between the events and the earliest copies of Christian documents is unusually short compared to other ancient biographies. For example, some letters of Paul are generally dated within a couple of decades after the events they discuss. Gospel compositions, even under conservative models, are often within a generation or two. That doesn't mean the texts are flawless or immune to theological shaping. It does mean historians have relatively dense attestation to work with, which strengthens the case for treating certain core claims, like that a man named Jesus lived, preached in first-century Judea, was crucified under Pontius Pilate, and had followers who proclaimed experiences that convinced them of his resurrection, as historically investigable assertions rather than pure myth. Grok also noted specific non-Christian references and archaeological confirmations that anchor the New Testament to its first-century context. Scholars point to incidental confirmations, names, titles, places, administrative details that align with what we know from independent sources. These concordances do not prove theological claims. They anchor the narratives in a plausible historical framework. The machine framed the question this way: if you have early documents produced by people with close temporal proximity to events, and those documents show independent lines converging around unusual details, the hypothesis that a significant historical figure existed and attracted a transformative movement becomes more probable. Next came messianic prophecy, a section guaranteed to stir debate. Grok treated prophecies as a special kind of prediction problem. The model examined how many discrete, measurable predictions are attributed in Jewish scripture to a future anointed figure, then assessed the probability that a single historical person could match a substantial subset of those specifics by coincidence. This is where statistical thinking meets hermeneutics, and the result depends heavily on how one defines prophecy, how one counts specificity, and what one treats as independent data points. To make the abstract concrete, suppose an ancient text lists a cluster of attributes: birthplace, suffering, chronological context, manner of death, certain social roles, and we treat those as independent criteria. The probability that a randomly selected individual from that historical milieu would satisfy all of them by random chance can look vanishingly small, particularly if we include highly specific items rather than broad, common motifs. Grok ran models that multiplied conservative estimates for each attribute and arrived at combined odds that were astronomically low. The machine emphasized that this approach is sensitive. Combining many attributes inflates improbability, but some attributes are not truly independent. The occurrence of one may make others more likely. For instance, A figure born in a particular town who becomes a preacher in that region makes certain social situations more probable. Recognizing those statistical dependencies is essential. The more careful probabilistic models account for correlation and shared causal pathways, the less extreme the improbabilities become. Even with those caveats, Grok's point was this: if you treat multiple specific predictions as largely independent and the historical figure matches them, that pattern pushes the hypothesis that the figure was intentionally fulfilling those predictions. Whether by design, foreknowledge, or some other explanatory mechanism, rather than mere coincidence. Again, this is evidence weighed within a probabilistic framework, not metaphysical proof. Different scholars will disagree about the independence and specificity of prophecies. Many will caution against simplistic, multiplicative models. Grok acknowledged these methodological debates and presented multiple sensitivity analyses showing how changing assumptions alters the odds. Then there is the single, central claim that has shaped 2 millennia of history: the resurrection. Grok approached the resurrection as a historical hypothesis to be evaluated alongside alternatives. Historians typically consider a handful of broad explanations when facing extraordinary reports: deliberate fabrication, honest but mistaken witness reports, psychological phenomena such as mass hallucination, theft or relocation of a body, or a miraculous event. Grok assigned probabilities to these scenarios based on historical criteria: early testimony, proximity, diversity of attestation, transformative effects on witnesses, and corroborating contextual details that are less likely to be inventions. A striking element in Grok's analysis was the attention to the transformation of the earliest followers. It is one thing for a group to lose confidence when its leader is executed. It is another for those same followers to become willing to die for a claim that they had seen the risen leader. Grok treated the disciples' subsequent behavior, public proclamation, willingness to suffer and die, and rapid growth of a movement as data points that are difficult to explain purely as long cons or hallucinations. That doesn't remove natural explanations. Some scholars argue that visions or intense grief can generate genuine perceptions of encounters, or that political and social dynamics can account for rapid movement formation. Grok ran models that, when factoring in the transformation and early proclamation, yielded a non-zero probability for the resurrection hypothesis that, while still low under conservative priors, was not negligible. In one sensitivity instance reported, Grok's point estimate for the resurrection, given certain priors, was described as the rough equivalent of 1 chance in 20 billion. This figure grabbed headlines, but it must be treated with caution. It reflects a specific set of starting assumptions about how to weigh testimony and which alternative explanations to consider. Change those priors, and the number shifts. Throughout these segments, Grok also identified pattern-like structures that it found intriguing: numerical symmetries, recurring prime-related frames in textual arrangements, and recursive narrative motifs. Some observers interpreted these as evidence of an underlying order or design. Others saw them as artifacts of literary convention or selective attention. The machine itself flagged the possibility of apophenia, the tendency to see patterns where none were intentionally placed, and advised careful statistical controls. That, more than anything, illustrated how an AI can function as a mirror. It surfaces patterns humans find compelling and then, if programmed responsibly, highlights the danger of over-interpreting them. Beyond arguments about ancient probability and documents, Grok also tallied Christianity's socio-cultural footprint. Here, the conversation shifted from "did this happen?" to "what followed?" The model summarized how Christian institutions have influenced the development of universities, hospitals, legal norms, and charitable networks in many parts of the world. It noted that monastic and cathedral schools were precursors to European universities, that faith-based charitable organizations played key roles in developing modern hospitals, and that Christian moral language provided vocabulary for human rights in some historical trajectories. None of this is meant to whitewash episodes where Christianity was complicit in violence or oppression. Grok was careful to present a balanced view. Institutional growth and social goods can and did coexist with misuse of power, and the overall legacy is mixed and contingent. The machine's takeaway was modest. When you weigh causes and consequences, religion, and Christianity in particular, has been a major vector of social change for better and worse. An inevitable question follows: can we trust an AI to make these judgments? This is where we must be especially candid about limitations. AI models are trained on corpora that reflect human intellectual history, the good, the bad, the biased, and the incomplete. Grok's conclusions are constrained by selection effects in its training set, by the prominence of certain scholarly voices, and by the phrasing of prompts. If the model is trained on more apologetic sources, it will weigh certain evidences more heavily. If it ingests predominantly skeptical literature, it will weight them differently. Moreover, models often echo prevailing cultural narratives. Their outputs can reinforce existing consensus or amplify fringe positions depending on how they're prompted. Grok's team recognized this and included analyses showing how different datasets and priors change outcomes. This is not a bug unique to Grok. It is the nature of any instrument that synthesizes human-produced information. So where does this leave us? If an advanced logic-driven system points toward Christianity as a coherent explanation for a cluster of facts, improbabilities in origins, dense manuscript attestation, multiple fulfilled predictions, transformative eyewitness testimony, and massive cultural consequences, we face a threefold invitation. First, to take evidence seriously. Data, especially when diverse and mutually reinforcing, deserves careful attention. Second, to remain humble about methodological limits. Probability estimates are sensitive to priors, dependence assumptions, and model specifications. Third, to remember the difference between explanation and existential commitment. A plausible explanatory model for historical facts is not the same as a spiritual conversion. There is also a pastoral dimension here. For many believers, seeing a machine articulate reasons that align with faith can feel affirming. For skeptics, it can feel like a curious anomaly or the product of biased inputs. For those on the fence, it presents an opportunity to investigate the underlying analyses, to read primary sources, and to consult contemporary scholarship. The discomfort and wonder stirred by a machine's unexpected verdict can catalyze deeper study rather than premature certainty. Critically, we must resist the temptation to substitute algorithmic authority for human judgment. Grok can be a powerful tool for clarifying probabilities and parsing complex datasets, but it cannot perform the human tasks of moral discernment, spiritual encounter, or existential decision. Nor can it, by virtue of calculation alone, establish metaphysical truths or guarantee salvation. Its role is evidential and interpretive, not sacerdotal. Finally, consider the broader philosophical stakes. If a mathematical model identifies patterns that point toward agency, does that settle metaphysical questions about God? No. But it does illustrate a convergence that deserves attention. Independent lines of investigation, probability in origins, early and multiple attestations in history, the statistical unlikelihood of fulfilled specific predictions, the sociological puzzle of transformed witnesses, can together form a cumulative case that pushes certain conclusions into the realm of reasonable belief for some people. That doesn't make belief universal or binding, but it shifts the debate from purely fideistic assertion to an evidential conversation that both skeptics and believers can enter. The episode with Grok is also a kind of parable about the relationship between technology and religion. Modern tools force ancient questions into new forms. Machines trained on human thought will reflect both our brilliance and our blind spots. When such tools surface a conclusion that aligns with a faith tradition, the healthy response is neither instant capitulation nor reflexive dismissal. Instead, we should interrogate assumptions, replicate analyses with different priors, consult experts across disciplines, and remain open to where the weight of evidence seems to tilt, while maintaining clear boundaries about what probabilistic reasoning can and cannot establish. So what should you do with this? If you're curious, start with the basics, read the primary texts, learn why manuscript attestation matters, and familiarize yourself with how historians evaluate testimony. If you're mathematically inclined, explore how Bayesian inference works and how changing priors alters posterior probabilities. If you're a believer, reflect on how evidence and faith have interacted in your own life. If you're a skeptic, use this as an occasion to test claims rigorously. Above all, keep a posture of intellectual humility and openness. If this topic hooks you and you'd like more deep dives where faith and technology intersect, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. To close, Grok did not convert anyone in that room. It did, however, force a gathering of scientists, theologians, and curious onlookers to take seriously a set of arguments that many had previously relegated to one side of the aisle. Whether you read the machine's output as a helpful aid, a provocation, or a reason to double down on skepticism, the productive outcome is the same. A renewed willingness to engage with the evidence and with one another in good faith. Tell us what you think in the comments. Does a probabilistic AI change how you approach questions of faith and history? Share this with someone who'd enjoy the debate and bring your best questions. Thanks for watching.